here we go. Yeah, okay. And make sure to click on the link for my outline now because I
Yeah.
update it. I've updated it with a few corrections since I sent the
Okay.
link.
Okay, cool. Yeah,
Yeah.
you've gotten to be quite the outline designer, I have to say, Huck. It's pretty awesome.
Outline Maven. Yeah. 1 second here. Okay. I couldn't find a reliable map like the one that I put
Uh-huh.
in last time because I did find a couple online, but then the more I read about it, the more I realized that it's not like a straight linear history.
Uh-huh.
A
Hmm.
lot of the time, there's a lot of just permeation of uh, the different traditions and so on. And so I'm not sure how easy it is to get a factual kind of
Yeah.
streamlined um, chart style approach to the Buddhist traditions. I think that the main divisions which are important to consider are between like Theravada and Mahayana, Theravada being the more conservative branch that is generally more sort of elitist and consider themselves to uh, hold closer to the original teachings of the Buddha.
Hmm.
Hmm.
So Theravada is the tradition that today is practiced mostly in Southeast Asia.
Hmm.
Although I think that there's like a separate branch of that developed into Tibetan Buddhism and so on and
That's
whatnot.
Vajrayana. Vaj,
That's right. That's right.
Vajra,
Yeah,
I don't know, Vajrayana.
that's right. And then that is actually somewhat distinct from the major lineage of Buddhism as it's practiced in India until I guess like the 12th century or so. From the 12th century on, Buddhism declines pretty much entirely
Yeah.
in India. And from what I understand, it's only now very slowly creeping back in. But that's kind of like a function of globalization and
Hmm.
this sort of thing. And it's not really like the indigenous Buddhism bubbling back up. It's just, kind of, I
Is
guess, like maybe even like Western Buddhism coming in through globalization and that sort of
is that
thing.
the Mahayana?
Well, Mahayana is a tradition that is distinct from Theravada, and there are a bunch of sub-traditions and so on. But there are like, hundreds of different traditions in Buddhism. So when you ask, is that Mahayana? Mahayana is like a way of categorizing lots and lots of different
Yeah, it's
traditions.
an umbrella.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But for our purposes, I think the most important strand of Buddhism with respect to the kind of philosophical dialogues with the Astika schools is Madhyamaka, which I'm still not 100% sure what the chronology between Mahayana and Madhyamaka is. Um, I've seen both Madhyamaka categorized as a sub-discipline within Mahayana, but I've also seen it described as the precursor to, or kind of like thing that develops into Mahayana. So
Uh-huh.
um, it's not really clear to me exactly what the history between Mahayana and Madhyamaka is. But for our purposes, Madhyamaka is the approach to Buddhist teaching that uh, well, certainly that he spends the most time on in this chapter, but also that produces pretty significant philosophers, in particular Nagarjuna, the
Hmm.
the kind of master logician, and then there are a couple commentators on his works that
Hmm.
uh, clarify it and sort of produce their own interpretations and whatnot.
Hmm.
Um, but I can't actually even remember how much detail is in the chapter and how much I learned from just going to other
And
sources over the
yeah.
last week.
Yeah,
Um,
they do cover. they do cover like that's the part of the end of the chapter that goes through different schools that have branched off more about practices than about basic orthodoxy, it seems to me. Uh,
Yeah, well, I mean, actually, we have a pretty good exposition of philosophical positions in this chapter. So
Hmm.
it's not only or even primarily about different sorts of practices in the sense of practices as a pathway to enlightenment. It's more he spends more time talking about the positions that come out of Nagarjuna's work. The oh my God, it's like a 27 letter title, which is usually
Yeah.
simply abbreviated as MMK.
Middle.
I think it's the Mula Madhyamaka Kirita or
It is. I'm looking at it
Kirati,
right
something
now.
like that.
Mula Madhyamaka Karika.
Karita, yeah, that's right. Okay, so we'll just call it the MMK for now.
Which sounds like a militant group.
Yeah.
Why? Because of Mullah? Well, I guess Mullah
Just
means root.
MMK, just I don't know why.
Oh, MMK. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, well, Mullah I think means root, right? Isn't that right?
Mhm.
And then
Yeah.
uh I don't remember um what is it, Karita? I can't remember what that one means. But in any case, I think probably today the best use of the time will maybe be to chart out a little bit of the context, historical, and the various sorts of practices and so on. But I'd like to spend a lot of time with Nagarjuna and a few different concepts. We'll spend some time with Anatman, spend some time with Sunyata or Sunyata. I'm never sure exactly where the accent is. Do you
The
know,
accent.
Sandesh? Is it Sunyata or is it Sunyata?
Yeah, the latter.
Sunyata? Yeah, okay.
Sunyata.
I've heard lots of Westerners mispronounce it in various ways, so I'm
Yeah.
not sure which way to go with.
Yeah.
Sunyata,
Yes.
Anatman, we remember maybe from last week, it's the no self
Hmm.
theory slash doctrine. And the extent to which certain positions are doctrinal versus theoretical, I think, are significant. Here, that distinction is meant to describe the source of, we might say, justification. So if something's doctrinal, if a belief is doctrinal, then I suppose the justification is from revelation.
Yeah.
Whereas if it's theoretical, the justification is through argumentation. You present a thesis and you defend it and so on, you give arguments.
Hmm.
And a lot of these different positions have both doctrinal and theoretical justifications, right? So
Doctrinal would be going back to the original Buddha or any other Bodhisattva.
yeah, and the
The
thing is
Vedas.
that most of the original sources are aphoristic, so they aren't themselves, arguments, which
Yeah.
means that a lot of quote unquote going back to the original sources means interpretation
Hmm.
of aphorisms where a lot is left out and a lot has to sort of be known just through tradition or through the particular kind of like quote unquote discursive community you're in, what
Hmm.
people sort of take to be true as part of their community and so on, versus the theoretical approach, which has certain benefits and certain drawbacks. I mean, we will probably talk about this today, but maybe I'll ask you, what is a potential drawback to a theoretical approach? In other words, an approach where you argue for concepts like emptiness, sunyata, or no self, anatman, or anything else through rational discourse. What might be a drawback to that, as opposed to some other kind of justification like revelation?
Hmm.
It all comes from the mind, if
Uh-huh.
you're talking about rational, but that already assumes a certain kind of position, I
Oh yeah,
think.
can you develop that? What does that mean? What position
Well,
do
I
you
mean, I
assume?
think he talked, and this is going back a couple weeks now or whatever, the first readings, he talked about the limits of Western viewpoint.
Well,
When
let's
you,
for now just bracket the Westernness of it because I think that you can find a lot of similarities in these basic problems and approaches either in, Buddhist
Yeah.
slash Astika.
I'm just saying that that's, I think, how he developed his argument a little bit in the first couple chapters. I know you guys started in
Well,
chapter.
here's another reason why I think it's good to bracket the word Western here, because if by Western we mean quote unquote maybe even overly rational or even just
Mhm.
rational, that is a pretty tenuous position. It's saying it's us, the West, that's rational,
Yeah, yeah.
and
He
everybody
he
else.
mentions this. He mentions this. Um,
Yes, I understand, but the point is that I think that we can get to the heart of the matter without invoking the difference between East and West. And
okay. Well,
there are good
I
reasons
probably,
not to invoke that.
I probably am going to be clunky in how I respond,
That's
but
fine.
being completely rational already presupposes a kind of difference. That was
What kind of difference?
a kind. Well, in his mind, that was the point I was making, and I think
Yeah.
we've maybe covered it now. But as soon as you say we are rational, and so we're looking at this, and it's not rational, and we make a difference of it, we've already overlaid our value concepts
Hmm.
on that. Now, if you take apart from that, what is just the limits, like not making the value judgment there, but what are the limits of just rationality?
Hmm.
I suppose is the question. And
Can I
yeah,
can I put the issue in a little story that Plato tells in the dialogue
sure.
Philebus? So there's this dialogue Philebus where Socrates, who, as the mouthpiece for Plato in this particular dialogue, is the avatar of rational debate, right? And he comes into a conversation with this guy Philebus, who is a hedonist. In other words, the matter at issue is what is the best way to live, a life of reason or a life devoted to pleasure?
Yeah.
And so Socrates, kind of lures him into a debate, and then they're giving reasons for which pathway is better, a life of reason or a life of pleasure. And halfway through, Philebus falls asleep. And the reason, I mean, one way of interpreting that is
Yeah.
Plato's recognition that if you're going to debate the value of
From a
life
rational
in terms
perspective.
of reason versus some alternative to reason, but the platform that you're doing that within is rational debate, then you've already
Yeah.
begged the question in favor of rational debate.
That's what I was trying to say. In other words, you're already looking at it in a specific point of view with the value
Yeah,
of,
yeah, exactly right. And it's to a certain extent, there's this concept of the performative contradiction, right? Which is to say, if I say I'm not saying anything, that sentence taken alone is not a contradiction. But if I perform it, then it is a contradiction. And there's a sense in which if I'm trying to give reasons for why I shouldn't be rational or people shouldn't be rational, but rather should seek
but they're
pleasure,
being rational doing it.
but there's a contradiction there. But the
Yeah.
contradiction isn't in what I'm saying, it's in the fact that it's being said.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And you see that same basic issue here with respect to, for instance, the theory or doctrine of emptiness,
Hmm.
right? Um, Emptiness. We may want to go through the outline to get more detail here, but if what I want to say is that everything that we take to be real is ultimately empty, which might more or less mean something like all, say, rational positions are ultimately false.
Mm.
What about the position that all rational positions are ultimately false?
Yeah, it's a little bit of you're in a paradox of it.
Right. Well, that paradox is only going to arise if I rationally assert or try to involve that assertion in a rational argument,
Hmm.
because the thing that I'm arguing for is the dissolution of rational argument.
Here's the thing: is this is where I got caught up into the chapter, into some of the concepts, and I really loved the chapter. I found it fascinating, but was some of the metaphors, and it seems to me like some of these positions, I don't remember which position it is, think that everything is just momentary dharma. Everything is in a state of change, and so
Mhm.
everything is ultimately empty, and yet everything is connected. So they believe in rebirth, but they don't believe in this soul, or what is it called?
Atman.
The Atman that continues. Except that some schools believe that karmic seeds can be started in maybe one of these rebirth cycles and show up in another. So they find this kind of, and they don't take extreme positions because the Buddha said,
Right.
and the
Don't be extreme.
take a middle way. And yet it's kind of a beautiful concept that if you think that everything is just momentary, then in some sense nothing is fixed, right? They talk about this. Where I got caught up was this blue pot. Is the pot really there? Are we just seeing blue?
Yeah, well, I think rather than maybe, I think as just a kind of introductory move, it's good to like bring up these disconnected things that were confusing. I think maybe we're, as a next step, going to just want to go through the outline because I think things will be more clear as we examine one position coming into contact with another one. Maybe what I would say, though, to summarize your point, is that it seems like the basic Buddhist attitude or even position is essentially contradictory. And so the question is whether we want to accept that that's true, or if there are different interpretations of these different concepts that can resolve the contradiction.
You're saying it's contradictory because you're saying,
well, for instance, you just said, I don't understand because they say you don't have a soul or an Atman or any real content, and there's no thing itself that continues, and yet reincarnation is true. How can something be reincarnated if there's no something?
Because it's all states of Dharma. It's all
that doesn't help because then it's like, how does the Dharma, what does it even mean to say Dharma? Like if you're saying that Dharma is changing, for instance, or what is real is change, you still have a thing to which you're predicating change, right? In other words, how can you have change without some thingness that accepts the change?
Yeah.
And so it seems like there are some contradictions at play. And I think maybe to a certain extent there are contradictions, but the contradictions only arise when they are asserted as a defensible position within a context of rational debate.
That's right.
However, that may not be true. I have a reason for believing that there's something fundamentally contradictory about, say, the emptiness doctrine understood in its most, I suppose, condensed or strongest form. And in fact, actually, the emptiness doctrine has two different major interpretations, one of which is much easier to understand.
Okay.
And one of which seems much more mystical or just deeply paradoxical. And it just so happens that historically it was the paradoxical one that became most dominant.
Okay.
There are different ways of interpreting, and historically people did interpret emptiness in different ways. But there's some question here where, let's say that, again, to go back to that example of the hedonist falling asleep in the middle of the rational debate, because what's the point? You've already given up your cause by agreeing to rational debate. I mean, the thing is, like, if you think that emptiness is ultimately ineffable, right, it's the sort of thing about which you can't say anything true.
Yeah.
Then an attempt to kind of have this sort of ecumenical approach where you take a Buddhist teaching and you try to put it in a package that can integrate it into Astika, the Hindu debate structure, right? The structure of like public debates between schools and so on. You've already begged the question against yourself, right? Because in packaging it in a way that can be expressed about which you can say true things, you've already distorted the thing you're trying to defend.
Yeah, sure.
Right. And so you can see something kind of interesting here. And there's a question, I suppose, let me just kind of suggest the two different interpretations and then suggest how certain problems might arise. There's the interpretation by, I think, Kiri, I think that's his name, um, which holds that everything is ultimately empty, but even that cannot be asserted. One thing that Nāgārjuna says is, all I do is deflate arguments, or all I do is destroy arguments. I do not present my own argument. I do not present my own position.
Okay.
Because if you present the position that all positions are ultimately empty, all positions are ultimately
Even
false,
that's
or at
empty.
least not true, then you're in a problem where you have committed yourself to an absolute statement, and you've just said there are no absolute truths.
Right.
And so one thing that you could do is say that the recognition of emptiness is ultimately mystical. There is nothing you can say about it. Because
I think
whenever
it's
you
also
do,
experienced by somebody who wasn't going through rational thought, right? It came, again, like you were talking about doctrine, that came from the original Buddha, that idea of achieving nirvana through realizing this continuity of suffering because of attachment, right?
yeah, well, let's not muddy the waters here, because that's starting to bring in.
But I'm just saying, maybe it has nothing to do with rationality, though.
Well, let me just finish my point.
Okay.
And I think it'll become clear. So, right. So we could take the position that emptiness is ultimately this kind of mystical belief, or maybe lack of a belief, or something like that, about which you can never say anything true. It doesn't mean that it's false, that emptiness is false, but whenever you try to express it in the, say, syntax of rational argumentation,
Yeah.
you're distorting the thing you're trying to defend.
Right.
One upshot of that on a just sort of sociological level is that kind of commits you to a sort of fundamentalism that makes it impossible to engage with people that disagree with you, except to maybe deflate their arguments or something like that. But then the other option, which is to put it in a package where it can be integrated into rational debate, the fundamentalists would say, no, what you're doing is anathema to what you're trying to defend. You're
Yes.
actually in a performative contradiction, right? And so one of the things that's kind of interesting here is that there is, I think, a kind of fundamentalism to the approach that says we cannot, and in fact should not, we ought not to integrate ourselves into the dialogues with other
Which
faith
is maybe why
traditions
they
or whatever.
separated.
Yeah, but the thing is that there's a sense in which that's the only sort of that's the only position that actually has integrity to a certain extent, because if what happens when you do try to integrate in a dialogue with other schools, you completely distort your own position and commit yourself to a performative contradiction.
Yeah, you'd be
Then-
from a fundamentalist.
Yeah, and so it's sort of interesting. I mean, I think that the same basic issue crops up in Abrahamic traditions as well, with respect to whether faith is actually amenable to reason, or if they're two completely
Yeah,
separate
right.
things. But in any case, that's probably good enough for an overview. Maybe we can.
Can I ask a question though? Because,
Yeah.
and sorry,
Sure.
Sadness, you might have some thoughts here that you want to chime in anytime, obviously.
Yeah, no, I think going back to the performative contradiction, and Huck, you mentioned how all these ancient texts are mostly aphoristic, and that might have been one of their ways around this problem of using aphorisms as opposed to like rational argumentation or something that you'd see in philosophical texts, and yeah, like using language, but sort of using it in a poetic or aphoristic way where you can still get at or somehow avoid the performative contradiction, right? So yeah.
Yeah, so
Can I say one other thing? One other thing we didn't mention is that they do talk about how these Buddhas or Bodhisattvas then see reality. It's like two sides of the same coin. They see it differently. So in other words, people are caught up in this cycle of rebirth,
Hmm.
this karmic cycle. Even if there's nothing that's permanent, it's just a state of impermanence. But they're caught up in this. The Buddhists, the Buddhas or the enlightened people who reach nirvana are not trapped by that. In other words, they still see it for what it is, but they're not somehow trapped by the suffering of it. That was my interpretation
Well,
of it.
that's essentially right. Nāgārjuna and others say that nirvana is samsara. So nirvana is
Mm.
the release from suffering. Samsara is the source of suffering, but they're
Yeah,
not different things. What's different is your attitude, essentially.
yeah, that was also interesting.
Yeah, yeah. Um, but let's try to go through the outline because I think it'll be nice to give some structure to this kind of
Okay,
Wild West format that we've got going on right now.
so it's complicated.
Yeah, it's complicated, but I think that, even though the organization of the outline is maybe kind of illusory because it is complicated and
Well, I
multifarious and
like it.
everything, I still think it's a useful fiction for now.
It's
Yeah.
great. It's great.
Yeah, so I suppose for me, I don't want to spend a lot of time on the doctrinal foundations, the things that come from the original teachings of Siddhartha. Um, uh, there are really there, I suppose, kind of the main two things is the idea of the middle path between extremes, and in particular, uh, with respect to Anatman, those extremes have to do with the belief, say, in certain non-dualist schools, that um, the self, the eternal soul, transmigrates from one life to the next, that there is this essential identity, Purusha or whatever, either within the person or as an expression of the unity of Brahman. But that's this actual substantial entity that really exists and that it's like the string that connects pearls on a necklace or something like
Hmm.
that. So that's one extreme, this idea of absolute essential self. And then the other extreme is, say, the Charvaka materialist extreme, which says there is no self,
And
everything
nihilism.
is material, and when you die, you're dead, that's it.
Mhm.
Right. And
Just
so,
above that on your outline, you said
mhm.
something about Aristotle virtue as a means between two vices. Do you have a second to talk about that?
Sure. That's just more or less to help me kind of position uh, this. But essentially, in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle also takes a kind of middle path approach. What he says is that every virtue you can name is actually the median or the mean between two vices. So let's
Ah,
talk
okay.
about courage, for instance, whatever. So courage exists on a continuum between cowardice and foolhardiness, and that courage is the mean between those. And you can
I
do that
see.
for any virtue.
Okay.
That
Okay.
that
Interesting.
that
Okay.
it's a kind of radically moderate approach to ethics,
Got it.
right? And I think that that's true also of the Buddhist teaching here. One thing that you might also take from that, although it doesn't follow directly, but that there's a kind of pragmatism there, right? Which is to say, it's easy to become committed to some rational belief, perhaps, or some deeply felt belief at the cost of all other options, maybe even to the cost of functioning effectively in the world.
Hmm.
Like, for instance, if I believe that generosity is the ultimate virtue and I completely commit myself to that,
Hmm.
I'm going to actually, for one thing, not be in a position to really be generous because I'm going to give away everything and then I
Yeah.
won't actually have any wealth to donate
Right.
or whatever. Um, and so it's an approach to ethics that is more about community to a certain extent, more about practical acting in the world.
Hmm.
And I think that's true both of Buddhism and Aristotelian ethics.
Yeah. They talked about a little bit how the Buddha, how can he use personal pronouns, and it's because he realized who his audience was.
Yeah, so
There's
we'll
a
get to that.
practicality.
That's a really significant issue, this idea of the two truths, the
Hmm.
conventional versus ultimate truth. But let's not worry about that yet. Let's just try to go in order.
Yeah. Okay.
Um, yeah, and so, one expression of the middle path is between the extreme of annihilationism, everything is just material, and then there is no soul whatsoever, versus what is most real is your essential soul, or something like
Mm.
that, the Atman. And so Buddhism tries to get a compatibilist position between these, which is to say, well, rebirth is real, but there's
Hmm.
no self.
Hmm. Right.
What the only thing that's real is perhaps the constantly changing dynamic, maybe even evolving process of rebirth,
Yeah.
but there is no you that is reborn, etc. And
Yeah.
most of these positions have that kind of compatibilist feature. I will say one thing, which Sanders is aware of with respect to compatibilist positions, they're always the hardest to defend.
Yeah.
Um, and so that's maybe going to be one of these places where it's like, uh, it seems like these Buddhist doctrines are paradoxes. For instance, how can you be reborn if there's no soul? And so
Hmm.
they're going to have to find some way to bring these seeming contradictions together.
Yeah.
But
They do.
in
Go ahead.
addition to the middle path, there's the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, which I'm not going to spend very much time on, but actually, I think I won't even say anything about the Eightfold Path. The main thing about the Four Noble Truths is, to a certain extent, what everybody knows about Buddhism, this idea that life entails suffering. To be alive, to be self-interested, etc., is to suffer. The cause of suffering is desire, craving, and that the path to enlightenment is not to um, free your soul, free your purusha in the sense that, say, the yoga schools were suggesting, or perhaps to like dissolve the world entirely, but rather to adopt a different outlook, a different attitude towards
Hmm.
reality, right? And
Hmm.
that's what nirvana is. Nirvana literally means extinguishing, but what is being extinguished is not material reality or even your own interests as a biological organism. It's rather your attitude
Hmm.
towards uh, self-interest,
Samsara.
towards desire, etc.
Yeah.
Right?
Hmm.
I want to mention the word contentment here.
Hmm.
That's used in the book. Nirvana as permanent
Hmm.
contentment as opposed to contentment from objects of desire.
Right.
Ah, right. To be free of this suffering is to be content in a different
Yeah. And
way.
there's actually a more or less rational argument for denying that you could ever have contentment from material objects, which is essentially that if material objects also don't have any enduring substance, then what you're trying to do is fill the hole in your soul with something that doesn't exist. There is
Emptiness.
nothing there.
More
It's
emptiness.
right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
precious.
Yeah, and so we've talked a little bit about these different metaphors. Don't have to spend too much time on this either, but I think it's fairly straightforward to contrast, say, the Azteca Atman traditions with the Anatman approach in Buddhism. This idea of is there a thread or not?
Yeah.
Right? And in fact, sutra literally means thread.
Right. Yeah.
It's that thing that I suppose connects the aphorisms generally when they're
Hmm.
aphoristic and so on, which is not explicitly stated.
Hmm.
What's maybe most obvious is the expressions that the
Right.
thread holds together, but in fact, without the thread, the expressions are incoherent. That would be the Atman position, I think.
Hmm.
Yeah.
The Anatman position is complicated, right? Because you have to figure out what is being denied. One thing that we've seen so far already is that if we go along with Aristotle and think that in order to have a concept of change at all, you have to have some concept of persistence through change,
Hmm.
then it seems like the Anatman position is in trouble because if you what you want to say is the only thing that's true is change, then you have change, which then implies the thing that's not changing, such that you have change,
Whoa, 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 whoa,
right?
whoa. Stop. Say that again.
In other words, if you don't have something persisting through change, you can't even talk about change because, to a certain extent, like let's say that it's a fiction, but let's just cut time up into slices, time points, for
Yeah,
instance.
sure.
Okay, so at time point one, my hand is down here. At time point two, my hand is up here. At time point
Hmm.
three, my hand is up here. At time point four, okay, but in order to see that as a change in the motion of my hand, you have to have some concept that is not changing. Otherwise, you have this completely distinct thing, and this completely distinct thing, and this completely distinct thing, and you don't have change, you just have a succession of things.
Sure. But the way I understood this was I tried to put my mind around that was that absolutely everything's changing on different timelines. So like your hand did not exist before it existed and before your mother existed, etc. That's the only way I could understand.
Yeah. So maybe it would help a little bit to get into the conventional versus ultimate truth distinction there, right? Like what someone like Nagarjuna is going to have to say is that, okay, yeah, it's true that if I want to talk about change, I have to posit some persistence through change that can accept the change such that I can even describe it as change instead of this and this and this and this and this and this and this and
Okay.
this, right? But that's just conventional. It's a function, say, of grammar or syntax. It just so happens that all Indo-European languages take nouns as primary parts of speech. One way of looking at that is that if I want to say, I'm eating a ham sandwich, I can have the me and the ham sandwich without the verb eating, but I can't have eating without me and the ham sandwich, right? Or like to say that right now, you might say, okay, let's say somebody asked you, oh, what were you doing for the last 2 hours? And then you said, um, uh, there was a lot of talking, right? Well, talking there, which is usually a verb, is now treated as a noun, right? There's a lot of talking on this call. But you can't do that grammatically with nouns. You can't say, for instance, right now there's a lot of, Matt Svoboda-in going on or something like that. Nouns can't be transformed grammatically into verbs, but verbs can be transformed grammatically into nouns. And that's
Okay.
a feature of all Indo-European languages. Actually, I think it's a feature of all languages. That's what Chomsky claims anyway. Um, and so what Nagarjuna would say is, yeah, okay, that's true about language, but that's just conventionally true because that's the way our language works. It's not, there's no reason to think that's ultimately true,
Right.
right? Now, there are a couple of things that come from that which are interesting. For one thing, that makes him reject one of the significant doctrines of the of like Mimamsa and Bhattacharya, the idea that language connects you to reality because reality is written in the language of, say, Sanskrit or in our case, mathematics, right? What uh, Nagarjuna and the Buddhists are going to have to claim is that that is all simply representational, right? Language is a way we model reality to ourselves, but there's no reason to think that the model is the same thing as reality, is the same structure. And in fact, there are reasons not to think that. Because among other things, if it's at all coherent to think that reality is ultimately a process, but if our language prevents us from grammatically expressing that, then there's a reason to think that there's got to be some discrepancy, or at least it's possible that there's a discrepancy between language and reality. Let me shut my door because my dog just barged in. 1 second.
You have a dog? What kind of dog?
Oh, I don't think he can hear.
Sorry,
What
what's
kind of
that?
dog do you have?
Oh, a little terrier, but this door doesn't have a good latch, and so he just pushes
Wait,
it.
I didn't hear him at all.
Um, yeah, so there are some interesting things to take from um, this idea that maybe so one thing that Aristotle shares with the Hindu schools is this idea that language and reality are just the same structure. In fact, that's a position that it finds its way into Christianity as well. Like I don't remember which, I think it's Matthew or Mark. No, I think it's Matthew. The book of Matthew starts off with saying, "In the beginning was the Word," right?
Yeah.
This idea that language, and the word there in Greek is logos, which is also the source of the word logic, right? It's
Right.
this idea that language, when you say something true about the world, it's not just the sentence that's true, but rather, and it's not just that the sentence is true because it fits with the other sentences that you believe to be true. It's that it actually is picking out a real state of affairs in reality. And that's only possible if there's some way that language can encode reality in its own logical structures. right? That's
Yeah.
a position that is shared between Hinduism and or at least the Astika schools and Aristotle, but it's a position that's being denied by the Buddhists because that's just conventional truth,
Hmm.
right? And so they can accept that, but they don't have to then say that their position that conventional truth isn't ultimate is incoherent, because it is possible to think of existence as ultimately a process, even if you can't express it grammatically.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah. Um,
So,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I don't know that it gets, I get turned around in a lot of internal thoughts
Hmm.
in this discussion. It's fascinating to me. It's fascinating to me. Hard to pin down, but so can I ask you, Huck? Like you're going through and describing based on your knowledge and reading and extra reading and understanding of Plato, etc., other philosophies.
I love how much derision you said the name Plato with. Plato.
No, no, I wasn't meant.
Okay. Well, anyway, what's your
No, no,
question?
I haven't
Your
read
comment?
Plato and
Yeah.
Aristotle like you have, so that's where I'm just like flying a little blind here. But when you look at all of this, are you, I get the sense, and tell me if I'm right, that you see Buddhism as sort of fundamentally untenable as a philosophy that's grounded and can absolve its or kind of get out of its inherent contradictions and paradox.
I think there are certain interpretations that are untenable, and
Hmm.
there are other interpretations that are not untenable.
Okay.
And I specifically say not that they're tenable, but that they're not untenable for a reason. But I'll explain that maybe a little bit later. One way to
Okay.
look at it, though, is that here's an easy way to avoid contradiction. Let's say, like whoever, Nietzsche or Nāgārjuna or whatever, I want to claim something like the following: there are no absolute truths. So first of all, neither Nietzsche nor Nāgārjuna actually claim that, but that's a
Okay.
typical paraphrase. But you can see there that the sentence "there are no absolute truths" is self-contradictory because it requires the belief in at least one absolute truth,
Yeah.
the fact that there are no absolute truths.
Right.
Here's a way, though, to say basically the same thing,
Mm.
but to avoid contradiction. All statements are ultimately subject to revision.
Okay.
The word for that, the philosophical word for that is defeasible. It means they can be corrected or revised. So we can say all positions are ultimately defeasible.
Okay.
Now, you see that that avoids the contradiction because it's true, or at least it's possible.
Yeah.
So when I say that,
Yeah.
I don't commit myself to the non-existence of absolute truths.
Right.
I actually am committing myself to the possibility that there might be at
Yes.
least one absolute truth somewhere. It's just we've never
Yes.
found it, and there's no reason to think we ever will find it.
Right.
But with respect to self-contradiction, if I say all positions are ultimately subject to revision, even the position that all positions are subject to revision could be revised if ever
Yes.
we
Sure.
find a
Sure.
position that's not subject to revision. It's
It
just we
gives you
haven't
an
found it.
out.
Exactly. And I think that that is the approach that you have to take with the Buddhist teaching.
Yeah. To me, I hear what you're saying, and it makes sense. I love this. Personally, I felt an affinity towards some of the concepts in this chapter on a personal level. This is just me personally. And I love the aphorisms, partly because I could conceptualize the concept without getting into my own rationality about where's the contradiction in it. Particularly, I liked one where he talked about how I think it was like it wasn't cheese, but it was milk or something like that. Is it?
I remember that.
Do you remember this?
Yeah, ghee and curd and
Yeah,
Oh, right, right.
yeah.
And
It's
the way it changes.
yeah.
yeah, the way it changes, and it's like he says, okay, he who is reborn, is he the same person as another? And the Buddha says, neither the same nor another. Give me an illustration. In the case of a pot of milk, which turns to curds, then to butter, then to ghee, it would not be right to say that the ghee, butter, curds were the same as milk, but they have come from that, so neither would it be right to say that they are something else.
Mhm.
and it seems to fit with this idea.
Yeah. In a moment, we will talk about a really interesting approach to logic that is really common in the writing of Nāgārjuna. And to a certain extent, I suppose that statement of the Buddha could also be expressed as at least a partial version of this. Um, it's known as the tetralemma. You all know what a dilemma is when there are
Hmm.
two possibilities, but they're both bad.
Hmm.
A tetralemma, which is like this really common but also characteristic form of argumentation in these Buddhist writers, says that there are four logical possibilities and they're all bad.
Oh, really?
Yeah. You keep tempting me to go totally out of order, but I think
Okay,
things
I'm
will
sorry.
really
No,
make
do
more
your
sense
thing.
if we just go in
Do
a
your
straight
thing.
line through this.
Okay,
It's
I
easy to
just
get
maybe can.
sidetracked because there are lots of cool things.
Okay.
The one thing that I would say is that, that I suppose the most persuasive metaphor to defend an Atman, the no self doctrine, is, this idea of the category mistake, which is going to be a significant concept, also with respect to the logic, the tetralemma, and so on. But the category mistake here is with the chariot analogy. Do you remember what that was, Sandesh? Do you
I
remember
can.
like Gilbert Ryle and The Ghost in the Machine and the idea of like you take somebody on a tour of a university and show them
Oh
everything,
yeah,
every single acorn,
right,
and
right,
then they ask, "Where's the university?"
right.
So
Yeah,
why don't you explain that to Matt and then um,
yeah. Let's say I'm like a potential like student who's starting at UW this fall or something, and I go to one of these like campus stores, and the student volunteer who's taking me around is like, "Oh, this is the library, and this is the school of dance or whatever." And then at the end of it, I'm like, "All right, you showed me like all these like different parts, but where is UW? Like, where is the university? Like,
Yeah.
all you've shown me is like these different buildings, but you're saying, well, this is part of the university." So
yeah.
again, kind of going back to this idea of like some persisting thing, right? And I guess this is also true of like a lot of things, right? These abstract objects like university or like a country or whatever.
In fact, even any concept to a certain
Yeah.
extent, right? One way of looking at it is that the word university there isn't a separate object. It's not like you find the library and the music building and the gym and in addition to all those things, you also find the university together in the same set of things. The university is like a summary of all
Yeah.
that, right? Just like any concept, you could say that like, I don't know, what is a triangle? And then you say, well, you've got side one, side two, side three, and by corollary, you've got angle one, angle two, angle three, etc. And then you ask, well, where's the triangle? No, the triangle is a summary of all of that,
Hmm.
right? The same could be said about selfhood, right? And so in this case, in say the university or in the case of the chariot, you've got all these parts, but the self is just a way of describing all those parts. It's not that there's some extra thing that is the basis of all those parts. Right. But rather that when we talk about selves, it's just a kind of conventional or labor-saving way of not having to say, oh, right now I'm talking and breathing and thinking and discussing and
Hmm.
blah, 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 blah,
Sure.
blah. And that's only possible if there's this underlying self. No, the self is just a way of describing all that stuff I'm doing
Hmm.
instead of the substance that those actions emerge from. There isn't nothing except the actions, and we summarize that by
Yeah.
saying, I'm doing that.
Right.
Something
There
like
was
that.
a school of Buddhism that believed in that a certain thread. I remember that.
I think they all do. I mean, that's a fairly
Okay.
universal aspect of Buddhism, that
Okay.
idea that
I
there is no
remember them
enduring
talking
self.
about it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah,
Yeah, I
and
have it here that Nagasena criticizes this Brahmanical analogy of the chariot as being composed of disparate parts. And the only reason they do it is because it makes it useful.
mhm.
Like, so there's this pragmatic thing to it that, um, yeah, it's just useful for us to like say university, right? Or a
Mhm.
triangle.
Mhm.
Um, because otherwise it would be chaotic, I think.
One
Language.
maybe kind of interesting thing for us to figure out, which is not expressed in the book, but was something that popped into my mind, is that they say, okay, look, here's the Buddhist position. All that stuff out there that you think is like a cat and a hot dog and whatever, all this stuff you want for whatever reason, that's all an illusion,
Yes.
right? But of course, just like Descartes, they don't claim that the illusion itself doesn't exist,
Yeah, that's right.
right? Experience must exist. But here's the
That's right.
problem. How can you have experience without continuity through experience? In other words, if what I want to say is I experience the world as this coherent, continuous collection of objects interacting with each other, and that might not be ultimate reality, but at least with respect to my experience, there is that kind of, continuity. There is that kind of, even if only conventional, persistence through change and so on. You can claim that that persistence through change is just a function or a property of your experience and is not
Mhm.
ultimately real in terms of like being distinct entities out there.
Right.
But the problem is, it's not clear to me that the doctrine of Atman actually needs to claim anything more than Atman is the continuity of experience.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I talk about myself, I don't think that this waving of my hand, which is some action that just happens, is like an essential part of myself. What's essential is my continuity through experience in my own life.
Yeah.
That's what the self is. And if the Buddhists are claiming that the only thing that's real is experience, and experience is continuous, it's not clear to me that they have disproven Atman. It seems like they have just proven Atman,
Mm-hmm.
that Atman is
Um,
true, right?
yeah. I was trying to find their language, or at least the language of this guy's book on this subject.
Yeah, well, we don't have to worry about what other people said. What are there ways to get out of that? Are there ways to suggest that yes, experience, we do have experience. In fact, you can't possibly deny that we have experience because the denial would have to happen within experience, right? Um, so then
It's all just perception, it seems to me. Like that's what they're saying. It's just perception.
I understand that, but the problem is that if by perception, first of all, it's not just perception if what we mean by perception is like what a newborn infant might experience, which is just like all this jumbled up stuff, just like a
Hmm.
flow of sensation or whatever. That's not what we experience. What we experience is a world of objects that have some kind of persistence, that have some kind of um, stability, and that interact, and you have change and so on. But the thing is that in order to experience that illusion, there has to be some continuity to experience.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, they're right.
So then the
They get
question is,
away from objects and subjects. They get away from. I don't know. I don't know how to.
okay. So then the question is, I guess, one thing you might want to say is, what exactly are they taking issue with in the doctrine of Atman?
Hmm.
Is it just continuity itself is bad, or is there a specific additional claim over and above just the mere fact of continuity in experience that they want to reject?
Mm.
Say that one more time, Doc, please.
Okay. Atman
Yeah.
suggests that there is a continuing self,
Yes, of
maybe
course.
even through multiple lives, etc.
Right.
Anatman claims that there is no continuing self.
Yeah.
All that we have access to is our the illusion,
Yeah.
but the illusion is something that requires experience. You can't have
Hmm.
an illusion without experiencing the
Hmm.
illusion.
Hmm.
And experience does have continuity because otherwise it wouldn't,
Yeah.
let's say that the world is not a bunch of discrete objects that are in relationships with each other, but we
I
have that
think.
illusion. The
Yeah.
problem is that the illusion itself has that stable structure to it. So then what we want to
Hmm.
ask is, can you get a version of the Atman doctrine that really only is descriptive of experience? That is to say that the self that we're talking about is the continuity of our experience.
Hmm.
And if so, then what could a Buddhist response be? Because if what you want to say is that experience is an illusion, but it's also in some sense the most immediate and real thing that we have access to,
Hmm.
and it has this continuity to it, it's
Hmm.
not clear that they have really shown that Atman is false if Atman means nothing more than the continuity of experience that we call the self.
It's that when they're looking at this continuity experience, they would say the suffering happens when you get caught into the trap of believing that they are enduring subjects and objects, and it then engages your desire.
Yeah, actually, that's one big part of it. I think one aspect is going to be the attitude you take towards that
Yeah.
sense of continuity. The other thing that I think you might want to raise is this idea of two truths,
Hmm.
right? The
Yeah.
conventional versus the
Yeah. That's right.
ultimate. And it's possible that you can hold in your mind that experience is necessarily continuous, has this
Yeah.
sense of persistence through the change of experience without then committing yourself to the idea that that's ultimate truth.
That's right. I think that's exactly the position.
Yeah, so that's what you would have to do, I think. And then again, the problem is, of course, that that is not a positive position. To a certain extent, ultimate truth is not really a good way of describing that position because it's a non-position. What I can say is if I can't deny that experience has that sense of persistence through change,
Hmm.
but I'm also committed to the idea that just because experience has that persistence through change, that doesn't mean that ultimate reality has that persistence through change.
Yeah. Yeah.
All I can say is something negative about experience, but not something positive about ultimate reality, because I can't know
Yeah.
ultimate reality.
Right. Right. Eh, Right. And I think at some point it said that they don't try to free themselves into some sense of nirvana as some other place to be, but that again, it comes back to the attitude. They see this continuous dilemma, but are not trapped in a feeling of or in an experience of suffering by it. They're somehow freed because of attitude.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that, again, taking the approach of deflation or like calling all things subject to revision is maybe a way out of that problem, right?
Yeah.
So, like,
Yeah.
what I might say is that, well, it's true, at least for me, that I can't have experience without persistence through change. However, I can also at the same time believe that if I were ever able to get any other evidence that might show that belief to be false, it's possible that, well, first of all, I don't think it's possible to have experience without persistence through change.
Hmm.
But when I say that that doesn't tell me anything about ultimate reality, what I'm
Hmm.
saying is that the position that experience tells me something about ultimate reality is subject to revision.
Hmm.
Still, I can't assert that I know anything about ultimate reality, but
Yeah.
but
I
I
don't think that they
can,
do. I don't think they're
yeah,
trying to say that. I don't think they're trying to say something about
they aren't, but I think it's really important to understand the kind of way of life or
yeah.
the way of dealing with arguments here, which is not
Yeah.
to assert anything positive, but
Hmm.
simply to show that, um, with maybe a few exceptions, most of the positions we would want to have are ultimately subject to revision, that there's
Hmm.
always a way to find an argument against them.
Hmm.
One argument here, which I don't think is easy to argue against, is the idea that experience requires continuity. I don't think you can have experience without
Yeah.
continuity.
I don't understand how you would. Yeah.
So, but then the thing is that I don't think that's what these authors are claiming.
But then
That
when they say continuity, it doesn't have to do with Atman. It has to do with the
Yeah.
fact that
So
continuity
so
has changed.
essentially what we're pointing up here is
Yeah.
like a distinction between ontology and epistemology, right?
Okay.
Like one thing that we might say is that our means of knowing the world, called experience,
Yeah.
has this necessary structure of continuity.
Hmm.
But there's no reason to think that experience and its continuity is an entity out there,
Hmm. Yeah.
right? It's just a feature
Right.
of a formal feature or a function of experience.
Hmm.
You don't have to reify that, turn
Hmm.
it into some object out there,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? And so there we see, I mean, for Sandesh, you'll see a lot of similarities to like transcendental logic and all this kind of
Yeah.
stuff, right? The problem of, you know, yes,
Hmm.
it's true that experience is unified, but there's a difference between saying experience is unified and saying that that is an experience of a unity,
Yeah, that's right. Did you
right?
guys do another philosophical course together?
We've been doing philosophy for 3 or 4 years now.
Oh my gosh.
Um,
Okay. Well,
but
again,
but
thanks
it,
for
but in any
having me
case,
in here.
let's
I hope
let's
I'm not
let's
slowing you down.
no, don't worry. Let's
Uh,
just yeah. Okay, go ahead, Sandesh.
is that are we is would you say then Buddhism is a form of delayed Platonism? That was something that came up in our one of our.
Platonism? I don't think so because I don't think that the point is ever to establish a final vocabulary in the word sense.
Right.
What I mean by that is that there's some question about the coherence of the statement, all positions are ultimately subject to revision. Because
Hmm.
in order for that to also be subject to revision, it has to be possible that there's at least one position that's not subject to revision, in which case it is possible to have a final vocabulary.
Hmm.
I mean, you
Um,
say that only because you can't hold a position without saying that there's the
well,
opposite.
okay, what would it mean to
Mhm.
say that I might be wrong
Yeah,
when I say that all
right. It could
positions
be
are
that there
subject
is
to revision?
something.
There would
Yeah.
have to be a position, at least
Yes.
that it's possible to have a position that's not
Right.
subject to revision in order for that
Yeah, I
statement
get
to
it.
also be subject to revision.
Wow.
So that's maybe an issue where now you could claim something, maybe this is a little too Kantian or something, but you could claim that yes, it's possible that there's some ultimate truth that's not subject to revision, but because our minds are finite, we could never access it. You could claim that. And so then you could say that everything is ultimately defeasible or subject to revision for us, even though in order for that statement to be coherent, maybe there is a position that is not accessible to us that is not
Mhm.
ultimately subject to revision,
Hmm.
right? So you could do that.
Are you going to come up with your own religion here? Huckism?
No, I'm just exploring the logical
No,
consequences of
I'm kidding.
these things.
Just it's
But
could be.
yeah. So what Sandesh was asking about, Matt? I'll just give a little bit of summary. So there's a philosopher who died about 10, 15 years ago now, Richard Rorty, who was kind of like a postmodernist philosopher, but came from the tradition of formal logic, analytic philosophy, and stuff. So he was like a really like technical, formal postmodernist.
Okay.
Um, and he has this idea that, no truths are ultimately defensible. It's a way of saying something like what Nāgārjuna is saying, that
Hmm.
uh, all say intellectual traditions, science, history, whatever, um, are always subject to revision, which means that what is important is the flexibility in dialogue
Mm.
to kind of develop new interesting approaches or directions or whatever, but that you constantly have to remind yourself that you're not in search of the final word on any question.
Yeah, right.
Okay. And so that's
It's the
what
searching.
Sandesh was asking about. At least that's the context. And then what exactly did you ask? You asked, are they in search of a final vocabulary, or did you ask something else? I don't remember now, Sandesh.
Oh, or if like Nagarjuna's philosophy is a sort of a form of
Oh,
delayed Platonism.
delayed Platonism. Yeah. And so what we mean by delayed Platonism here is simply, let's say that, actually, that was with respect to Hegel. We were talking about the
Oh,
problem
right.
of delayed Platonism. Let's say that knowledge, understanding, truth, et cetera, is this developmental process where, we constantly revise things we think are true and so on. The question is it ever possible to get to a final state where the whole sphere of truth has been unveiled or developed.
Mm-hmm.
That would be delayed Platonism, which is to say,
Okay.
look, we don't know the whole truth, but in our dialogues with each other, we're trying to find the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And at some point, at least in principle, we should be able to establish a truth for all times.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that's kind of tricky is like, in order for something to be true, in order for a sentence to be true, it does seem like you have to have this sense of, at least in principle, some position being ultimately true.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, but then the question is it possible to have an approach to truth which is completely dialogic all the way through? That's
Mm-hmm.
completely not about there being some stable uh, ultimate truth that you can appeal to, but rather the truth is somehow to be found in the coherence of the conversations that we're having about the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a few different ways of looking at that. One thing that you might say is maybe the final stage of truth that we are moving towards is something that incorporates both unity and difference.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if I want to say that I've reached ultimate truth, I have unified all true propositions. Is it clear what I'm saying there?
Mm-hmm.
You know, but then that's a sort of Platonism, which says that truth is ultimate and stable. Is it possible to have a conception of ultimate truth that has the sort of unity that Platonic truth has, while at the same time incorporating a sort of tension, a sort of conflict between, say, competing ideas or differences and this sort of thing? I take it that second option is more descriptive of Buddhism.
Yeah.
I would say like something that Nāgārjuna would say is probably something like this. With respect to the sentence, all beliefs are defeasible, all beliefs are ultimately subject to revision. Conventionally, it's true that in order for that to be coherent, I have to also assert the possibility of an ultimate truth that's
Mm-hmm.
not defeasible, but that's just conventional. Because maybe there's something about the structure of logic that requires that. But there's no reason to think that the structure of logic even is the structure of reality,
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
right? Logic may just be a particular way that we model reality,
Mm-hmm.
but there's no reason to think that the model just is the same thing as
Yeah.
reality.
Mm-hmm.
And it's true that conventionally, when I say all positions are subject to revision, that's more like a rule of thumb that helps guide me through life.
Mm-hmm.
That it helps me to avoid attaching myself to things that I really want to believe or that I really want to argue for or
Mm-hmm.
whatever. Um,
Middle way.
it isn't ultimately true. Even that is not ultimately true, that all positions are subject to revision, because maybe one way to look at it to bring Kant in is to say that the very concept of an ultimate truth is perhaps completely unreachable for me.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
And I could posit it as this sort of idea of reason or idea of logical debate or something, but it's not something that is even really coherent to me,
Mm-hmm.
or at least it's not accessible to me.
Mm-hmm.
In my life and my pragmatic dealing in the world, it's enough and it will always be enough because we're finite
Mm-hmm.
to I'm not so sure if the finite picture, the picture of us being finite is really something that could be said in Buddhist circles. I suppose that one thing you might want to say is the picture of the world in terms of samsara is the picture of the world from the point of view of finitude.
Mhm.
I suppose nirvana would maybe be the picture of reality from the point of view of infinity. And so then maybe the problem comes back in, right? Like, I suppose that nirvana would have to be, nirvana, I think, is very much like that second condition of ultimate truth where I say that it incorporates difference while
Mm-hmm.
also being ultimate,
Yeah.
because you do have all of the same things that you have in samsara. It's
Mm-hmm.
just that now you see how they all are part of this vast, interconnected network of relationships.
Mm-hmm.
You
Yeah,
know,
at some point they say that samsara, there's no difference between samsara, nirvana, and sunyata, which is emptiness.
Mhm.
So if we view samsara as a cycle of rebirths, and nirvana is this state of permanent contentment or emptiness. It's sort of, they can all converge towards some sort of an um, infinity or something like that.
Yeah, but I take it it has to be, one thing that one distinction we can point up is the distinction between, say, eternity and infinity,
mm,
right? Because eternity often has this sense of stability
yeah.
to it. Like, if X is eternal, it doesn't change. Infinity could be thought of, however, as, just like an infinite regress of change, that there's no
Mm.
point at which it resolves to stability or something like that. And I think that that would have to be the position of nirvana, that nirvana is both the ultimate reality,
Hmm.
but in the fact that it's just the flip side of samsara, it also um, it incorporates the differences that underwrite samsara. What I mean by the differences that underwrite samsara is the belief that samsara understood as constant rebirth, constant craving, search for the object of desire or the end to rebirth and so on. So, oh my God, my dog. Oh, just a second. There we go.
How did you? Oh, go ahead. Thought it was going to be longer.
Um, Sorry about that. Samsara requires this distinction between me and, say, the object of desire, or this life and the next life and this kind of thing. And all of that is still there in nirvana. It's just that it hasn't become integrated. Rather, I see the integration of one life to the next, or that object and me, or this person and that person. I recognize that everything is ultimately interconnected. So it's an epistemological shift, right? Before, the state of affairs was the same, but I didn't see the interconnection. In nirvana, I do see the interconnection.
Mhm.
And so the
Yeah,
differences are still there. I just recognize them not as true differences, but
yeah,
as, different sides of a relationship.
that's right. And there's also something in nirvana that you cease all craving, and even the attainment of enlightenment. You even cease that desire to attain that. I think you kind of
Well, I think
you.
what ceases is the desire to free yourself from samsara,
Yeah, right.
right? Which is sort of strange because if you've already freed yourself from samsara, then you're not desiring anything anyway. So then why would you?
Yeah,
But I suppose, like, the point of view of, like, the Mahayana point of view, that the bodhisattvas don't, like, transcend to some
uh,
spiritual realm of nirvana. They're still here in the world helping unenlightened
yeah, yeah,
creatures, see the relationships between things.
yes.
Um, that's to say that they're still within the realm of samsara.
Mhm.
It's just that they have a different understanding of it, a different
They
attitude
don't feel
towards
as
it.
trapped. They don't suffer by it.
Yeah, and so one way that I put it here is that, um, and there's some school that defends this particular interpretation, but nirvana is seeing the illusion as an
Mhm.
illusion and
Yeah, that's
recognizing
right.
it for what it is, instead
Right,
of taking the illusion to be how things really are and,
right.
torturing yourself because
Yeah,
the way that the world ought to be and the way the world seems to be in
yeah.
reality don't match up.
Yeah, he says here, if you are enlightened, then you see reality in terms of nirvana. However, if you're unenlightened, the world is a source of continual re-embodiment and suffering, dukkha.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's even without getting all terminological about it. I mean, it's to the, like, the ELI 5, explain like I'm five version of this. It would be something like, even 5-year-olds know that the way they would like the world to be, and of course, they're probably driven by desire and all this kind of stuff, but they can tell that there's a difference between right and wrong,
Hmm.
and that um, things happen in the world that shouldn't be the case, that ought not be the case. People hurt each
Uh-huh.
other, your favorite toy breaks, whatever. There's a sense in which just the very recognition that the way things are is different from how they ought to be
Hmm. Yeah.
is enough to um, suggest that perhaps there's a different way of looking at the world that um, sees it for what it is, that is to say, that takes the world as it is as an illusion instead of just being
Right.
different from how things ought to be, and recognizing that the illusion itself is I don't know, there's a sort of resignation, perhaps, because we're not actually trying to transcend to some spiritual realm where everything that ought to be ought to be. It's just that we recognize that the world as it is what is there, but it's also to a certain extent an illusion. We just recognize the illusion
It seems like
as
it's
an
just
illusion instead of something
it's
that.
a path to
So
relieve suffering.
what I would want to say is just that we recognize that there's not really a discrepancy between how the world is and how it ought to be.
Yeah.
Rather, we recognize that the world is as it is.
Yeah. Yeah. But they're freed from the suffering when they see it differently.
Yeah, because the suffering, I think, here would be the desire to make the world as it is into the world as it ought to be, instead of recognizing that, it's interesting because if you do recognize that the world is as it is, whether it's an illusion or not, I mean, then what is your approach going to be to the, say, the suffering of others? I mean, is suffering ultimately bad, or is suffering just part of the world as it is?
Yeah,
That's
well, it does seem like right. It does seem like they stick around and they recognize that suffering is bad. I mean, they see it as a maybe a necessary part of life until you reach a state of nirvana and don't suffer. But I think that they see it for what it is, that suffering is their path is to relieve suffering by relieving themselves of the illusion of.
yeah. Of course, they also think that that is ultimately self-interested unless you can help others
Yeah, they come back
achieve
and help it,
enlightenment.
right.
But I guess what I'm asking is, is the is existence. So, like, if we take the illusion to be an illusion, including all the desire and all the suffering and so on, um, I'm also like tempted to put it in like capitalist terms or something. Let's say I'm opening a business as a bodhisattva to help people become enlightened. I might think that business is going to be great for the rest of eternity because there's something fundamental about existence
Yeah.
that means that certain people suffer until they reach enlightenment. And if I take that to just be the condition of the world, then that would be great for my business as a bodhisattva. It might not be great for everybody, though. You understand what I'm saying? Because there's always going to be people suffering until they reach enlightenment, right? Because if I take the world as it is to not really be distinct from some transcendent world as it ought to be, one feature of the world as it is that people misrecognize the world as it is,
Yeah.
right? But it seems like from a sort of, you know, soteriological or like salvation oriented point of view, where I want people to stop suffering, I want to get rid of suffering, that would be to misrecognize the world as it is and wish that the world were different from how it is.
I don't know. I just see that they are freeing themselves first, but then once they free themselves, they realize that they don't enter a different realm and all of that, and that because there's also all of these virtues that go along with being a good person. It's not just
Mm-hmm.
these beliefs, but there's certain practices about, I forget what they all are, but
I
live a
understand that.
virtuous
Yeah, yeah.
life.
That's part of like the Eightfold Path, right? Like
Yes,
the
exactly.
good deeds is one of the
Yeah. Right. And so
right.
then they realize that's not ultimately just for themselves.
Yeah, I understand that. I guess what I'm getting at though is that in order for a deed to be good, it ought to be the case. In other words, me holding this cup is not good or bad necessarily, unless there's some other interest that I have in mind. But like, it's not true that it ought to be the case that I'm holding this cup. So
Yeah.
it's not good. But if I want to tell you the truth, if I ought to tell you the truth, or if it's good for me to tell you the truth, it
Hmm.
means I ought to tell you the truth,
Hmm.
right? So if it's good to alleviate suffering,
Hmm.
then we ought to do the good deed of help people alleviate suffering.
Hmm.
But then there's this weird sort of thing where it's like, if in reaching nirvana, you don't see the world as it is as distinct from some other maybe realm or way the world could be, the more ideal world. If if enlightenment just means recognizing the world and all its pain and all this kind of stuff as it is, but having this kind of detached relationship to it,
Hmm.
where
Yeah.
you're not suffering,
Yeah.
it's not really clear why you would need to help other people stop suffering if what it means to stop suffering is to not imagine the world as it is, as distinct from nirvana. Samsara is not distinct from nirvana. Because the thing is that samsara is always going to be there as the way the world is. Nirvana simply means accepting that, this sort of
Hmm.
radical acceptance, this
Hmm.
cessation of desire, but not really changing the world as it is into the
Yeah.
world as it ought to be. So then
Hmm.
the question would be, okay, but then to go back to the analogy of me and my bodhisattva business, right? It seems kind of strange, like there's maybe like this sort of contradiction there where it's like, um, if I think it's a good deed to help people become enlightened, it seems like I'm saying I ought to help people become enlightened.
Hmm.
People aren't enlightened. Not everybody is enlightened. Suffering is still happening, and suffering will always continue to happen. So then that ought seems to deflate. It seems that when there doesn't seem to be any specific motivation in helping people become enlightened, because that is to suggest that I ought to change the world into some other more ideal picture.
Right. Which you already accept for what it is.
Yeah, and so it does seem like maybe there's this, I don't know, maybe I just don't know enough about that attitude shift in nirvana, but it does seem like if you want to think about, you know, bodhisattvas and their imperative, their kind of like their mandate or whatever to help other sentient beings achieve enlightenment, it seems like what you're saying is there's a moral ought there. You
There
really
is. Yeah.
morally ought to help people achieve enlightenment. But then if you also think that what enlightenment means is recognizing that there is no real distinction between the world as it is and the world as it ought to be, then you can't possibly have a coherent ought.
Well, yeah, but I don't think they're concerned with it. I don't think they think that way. I mean, that's us applying this, trying to make sense of it all in a cohesive way,
Not really, because
right?
they do use terms like good, right? They do use
Well,
terms
what I'm
like
saying is, okay, I'm reading this, and again, this is this guy's interpretation in this book, but he says the
mhm.
advanced Mahayana practitioner known as the Bodhisattva, one destined to be enlightened, continues to take part in the realm of samsara even after attaining complete enlightenment for the sake of the alleviation of the suffering of all sentient beings. That's what we're talking about.
Mhm.
And you're wondering why they would do that.
No, I'm not wondering why, because there may be other non-moral explanations.
Okay.
I'm wondering whether it's a moral imperative for a bodhisattva to help
To
the
do that.
unenlightened.
Yes.
And it
And
sure
I don't,
seems
and what
like it
I'm trying to
is.
say is I don't know that I'm not saying I know that it's yes or no, but I don't know that they apply that kind of thinking to the
Yeah,
value system.
it may be that the thing that's tricky about it is that so first of all, I think that there are a couple different interpretations in the different schools. So in Theravada Buddhism, as I understand, they don't have this whole thing about the bodhisattvas staying in the wheel of samsara and helping enlightened
Oh,
individuals. It's all about like monastic experience, and not everybody is destined to become enlightened, and that's fine.
Yeah.
It's
okay.
in the Mahayana tradition
Uh-huh.
that you've got this, what seems like a moral imperative for the enlightened to then help the unenlightened.
Yeah.
Now, the problem is that it also seems, and maybe I'm mixing up my schools or whatever, but it also seems like they are using evaluative language, like You're supposed to do right things, good things.
Yes, yes, yes.
And I don't see how, but at the same time, it also seems like part of nirvana means detachment from desire, which means the
Yeah,
cessation of evaluation.
right,
There are no good or bad things ultimately. Everything is as it is.
right,
But if there are no good or bad things ultimately and
right.
everything is as it is, then it's not true that you ought to help the unenlightened.
I get it. I get it.
Where did you, where was this, Huck? The thing of ought to help the enlightened? Was it in somewhere in
Well,
the.
I'll see if I can find it in my
I just
outline.
read a little quote from it. It was in the chapter,
Yeah, he
but
talks about it
not
a little bit in
ought.
the
It didn't
chapter. I'll see
say
if I
ought.
can. I have a really. I didn't express it in this way in the outline because I'm just having these ideas now. But
Yeah.
it has to do with. I'll see if I can find it. So there's this claim. I think it's in maybe Madhyamaka. I'm not sure exactly which school it is, but there's this claim that even the search for enlightenment, the search for the end of samsara, can be taken to be self-interested,
Hmm.
unless once someone reaches enlightenment, they then adopt this persona of the bodhisattva that remains in the
Helper.
world of samsara and helps the unenlightened.
Selfless altruism.
Yeah, basically that's right. I mean, I'd have to go through here in the chapter and whatever sources to find like the most cogent expression of it, but I think we have a pretty good idea for
Yeah.
it's not like a hard idea to understand, right? It's like, yeah, if the imperative is to gain enlightenment, one danger of that might be that once I get enlightenment, I just shut off the rest of the world and just do my nice enlightened thing and, whatever. I turn into a monk and just meditate and don't help anybody else. But then that would be self-interested, selfish. And that's
Hmm.
not the point of enlightenment. The
Right.
point of enlightenment is then to re-engage with the world as samsara, which is not distinct from nirvana, but the world of suffering to help the unenlightened.
Hmm.
And then I was just sort of thinking, if what we mean when we say that nirvana, here's one way of talking about the attitude shift, right? If samsara and nirvana are like they're coextensive, in other words, they refer to the same world, it's not that nirvana is a different world from samsara. They're the same world.
Yeah.
What's different is what we know about it. What's different is our attitude towards it.
Yeah.
What's different is how we evaluate it. We evaluate samsara as bad because suffering. We evaluate nirvana as good because no
Yeah.
suffering.
Right.
Okay. But then that suggests that in trying to I suppose maybe what I don't know I guess here's what I'm saying maybe this is another way to get at it. It seems like when you say that the world is the same in samsara or nirvana, but that any particular person's consciousness of it changes or any particular person's attitude towards it changes, what you've just done is say attitudes and consciousness are not in the world, because if what you're trying to do is change people's attitudes,
Hmm.
and if you can do that without changing samsara into nirvana, changing the world, then you're saying
Yeah.
that, well, I'm changing their attitudes, but their attitudes aren't part of the world. That's the only way it makes sense, because otherwise, what you have to do in order to help people go from samsara to nirvana is change the world with respect to the attitudes people have in the world.
Hmm. What? Right. I see what you're saying, Huck. It's also interesting that like there's a sentence in here. Nevertheless, the early Buddhists clearly believed that one can make a distinction between wholesome and unwholesome mental states and
Mm-hmm.
dispositions,
Mm-hmm.
and cultivate the former along with analytical wisdom in order to see things more clearly.
Mm-hmm.
So, again, they're obviously clearly making value judgments between what's good and bad. And sorry, my son is asking me something. What?
Yeah,
I need
yeah,
to.
yeah. No, I think that's correct, and I guess it would come down to hello. It's tricky, right? Like, so one thing you might say with the two levels of truth is, okay, maybe those evaluations, wholesome or not wholesome, maybe that's
Uh-huh.
just conventional. Maybe ultimate reality is value neutral. It just
Uh-huh.
is. Maybe there's a really strong fact value dichotomy here. The world is what it is, and we can evaluate it in different ways, but those evaluations are just conventional.
Yeah.
Still, then it seems like it's maybe a bit of a problem if nirvana means recognizing, well, I don't know, maybe recognizing the illusion as the illusion is recognizing conventional illusion or conventional evaluation as conventional. But the problem is, how can you recognize conventionality as conventional without then that becoming something like an ultimate position, right? I mean, it seems like if I'm saying that evaluation is just conventional, then it seems like I'm committing myself to at least one ultimate position, that is that there's a sort of coherent structure to the conventional truth, right? That is ultimately true, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure if wholesome and non-wholesome is like value laden. I think maybe what wholesome means is like unity, and non-wholesome means world of objects distinction.
Yeah.
Because yeah, when we think of wholesome, we think of like, oh, the cake was wholesome or something like as value laden. But I'm wondering if it's
Maybe I could put it this way, because I still don't think that resolves the problem. Maybe I could put it this way. And maybe it's completely possible that my interpretation is just wrong with respect to what it means to reach nirvana and what it means to, change your attitude and so on. But let me try to put it this way. If nirvana means recognizing the world as it is for what it is, and not desiring to change the world into something it isn't or couldn't be, then why would I try to reach enlightenment? Right? It seems like the very idea that we could reach enlightenment is, at least with respect to our attitudes in the world, to change the world, to make it something, to go from what the world is to some other thing, some other understanding of the world. And it just seems like if we want to reduce out value language, if we want to say that no, wholesome and not wholesome is actually just a not an evaluation, but a description of the interconnectedness of reality and so on. I don't necessarily see why anyone would ever have the imperative to reach enlightenment, because it seems like it would be fine just if nobody reached enlightenment. Yeah, people would suffer, but that's the way the world is. And to wish suffering away.
They want to relieve suffering. They want to relieve the cycle of suffering.
Yeah, there's the whole section on karmic seeds, the repository of our, from all the previous generations or whatever, and like all the things that they did, which end up becoming seeds in my life, which come into fruition, right? And the whole project is to reform the repository.
Yeah.
You reform what?
The repository of the seeds.
Yeah, right, right. The store consciousness, right? I've
Yes.
said that term. Yeah. I guess what I'm still wondering, though, is what is the moral dimension of nirvana? In other words, is nirvana actually value neutral? Does it evaluate certain modes of life, certain modes of consciousness, attitudes, or states of affairs in the world as better than others? Or is it just a recognition of the facts without values? It isn't clear because it seems kind of inconsistent. Sometimes it seems like, to release yourself from suffering means no longer evaluating things as better or worse. But also, it seems like they definitely evaluate nirvana as better than, or enlightenment as better than non-enlightenment.
Yeah, because why would they do it?
Yeah, and so there seems like there's some inconsistency that makes it really hard to.
I mean, I think they see suffering as something to try to transcend. I mean, that's just essentially it.
We never got to the phenomenological account of Buddhism yet,
Yeah,
and
right.
it might be helpful to delve into that to figure out.
I'm also curious about the tetralemma.
Yeah, yeah, because we haven't talked about emptiness yet, or at least not in any real kind of depth. And so maybe just to structure our time a little bit, we could. Hmm, I think to a certain extent, more deep and intricate conversations can wait until the next chapter because I think that in the following chapters they get deeper into these sorts of conflicts and possible contradictions and so on. This chapter is just kind of the overview, and we're maybe to a certain extent going deeper than is warranted by the chapter. But in any case, I think we could either decide to take the phenomenal approach or talk about emptiness. I think maybe for our purposes, it would be good to go with the emptiness in the next 20 minutes or so, and then talk about that approach, and then maybe save the phenomenal.
I have to. You guys go ahead, please. Don't do anything. But I realize I need to pick up my mom at around 11:30, 11:35. So I'm gonna have
Okay.
to leave here in about 15 minutes.
Okay. So 15 minutes should be
Can
fine to choose
Yeah.
one direction. I,
you quickly talk
I'll
about a
let
tetralemma, or can we leave that for next time if that's?
we could potentially leave it. I don't know. I'm sure he's going to talk about this somewhere in the book because it's
Oh,
a very
okay.
significant
I'm really
aspect
curious
of
about what that
Buddhist
means, but
logic.
I'll make a note to come back to it just to ask you next week.
Um, I could spend, I probably need 6 or 7 minutes to go through that.
Okay, that's all right.
What did you want to bring up with respect to phenomenology, Sandesh? Maybe you can just wrap up the last bit of stuff that we're talking about from a phenomenological perspective.
Yeah, so they were classifying the Hindu school as a form of, or the Brahmanical school as a form of ontology, which tells you what really exists, right?
Hmm.
As sort of like, uh, you know, labeling things around us or whatever. And then the Buddhist school has a phenomenological
Hmm.
point of the world where
Hmm.
it's really about, uh, you know, to the things themselves,
Hmm.
right? To
Sure.
see things as it is.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, so I thought maybe it would help us to understand suffering and all these things that we're talking about from maybe a phenomenological aspect, or maybe
Right.
go. Um,
Yeah, I think that that is going to be a well. There are all these, each of these subjects, say phenomenology or emptiness, or these whatever like Gordian knots that are. There's so
yeah,
many mind-bending directions to take it in. I guess one thing I would want to point up is, when I was talking about say samsara nirvana and the attitude shift.
Mhm.
And to say that maybe that attitude shift to transform samsara into nirvana is a change in phenomenology, that is a change in the way things appear to us or what we take things to be and so on. But it also seems that if you're taking samsara to be the same thing in terms of reference, that there isn't a separate world. They're not two different worlds. It's the same world under two different names.
yeah,
Um, then it suggests that if there is a change at all, and the change is only phenomenological, that it seems to suppress the premise that phenomenal states are not part of the world.
hmm
Because to
yeah,
change phenomenal states, if they are part of the world, is also to change the world.
right,
If they're not part of the world, then you can change your phenomenal state without actually changing samsara into nirvana.
Yeah, right.
But the thing is that that seems to suggest a basic like dualist position that consciousness is this free floating thing outside the world,
right,
which
Okay.
doesn't seem coherent with respect to Buddhist ontology.
yeah,
Anyway, maybe
Sure.
let's leave that now because I think probably the problem that is arising is I'm trying to assert something positive. I'm not sure
mm,
that I think actually without trying to assert a positive doctrine, you still have the problem that you can have negations that conflict with each other too. And I
hmm
think that's actually the problem with this. But in any case, um, maybe part of the confusion could be resolved by examining Nagarjuna's claim that he's not making a claim when he talks about emptiness, when he talks about anatman, and so on.
mm,
If you go to, let's see, I guess it's page oh, 8 or so. Yeah, page 8 of the outline where we got Nagarjuna and the Madhyamaka school, the middle way school, and this central doctrine of sunyata, emptiness.
Hmm.
Page
I
8.
think that the best way to understand this, as far as I can wrap my head around it, is kind of not to do what we've been doing, which is to extrapolate into a really general context, but
Right.
rather to think of the position of emptiness as a response to a really specific claim that's made by other schools. And it has to do a lot with what you were describing, Sandesh, which is this idea that, um, you know, some schools are claiming that Atman really is an object out there in the world, as
Hmm.
opposed to some function of experience or some function of
Yeah.
consciousness.
Yeah.
And from that perspective, emptiness makes a lot of sense because all it is the denial that things like the unity of consciousness are actually objects out there in the world,
Hmm.
right? Um, the way that Nagarjuna talks about it, however, is a little bit different. He's not really talking about the subject-object distinction. It's more with respect to atomic being versus relational being. And let's see if I can find the Sanskrit word for relational being. I know it's here somewhere. It's like 6 syllables long or 8 syllables long. No, where is it? It's uh okay. Oh yeah, there it is. Relational being, which is what he takes to be, I think, synonymous with emptiness. So when he's saying that everything is empty, what he's really saying is nothing has a substantial atomic being on its own. Whatever
Yeah.
exists relationally to everything else that exists.
Yeah. There's the house of cards metaphor that they give where
Yeah.
you can't say that this particular card is supporting this particular another card or something, but it's the entire interdependence of all the
Yes.
cards.
The interdependent being. So the Sanskrit word for that is pratitya samutpada. That's right. Pratitya samutpada. Relational being. Yeah. And apparently that is one way of understanding emptiness. I mean, to a certain extent, it feels sort of unsatisfying because it's not nearly
Yeah.
as mystical as the idea that everything is ultimately empty or everything is ultimately um, maybe even sort of nothing ultimately exists. Those are certain interpretations. But I think that another way of saying everything is ultimately relational is everything is ultimately subject to revision
Yeah.
when you recognize the functional relationships that everything has to everything else, right?
Yeah.
Um, like if I wanted to get an absolutely precise and timeless definition of some object, say triangle or whatever, and I say 3 sides, 3 angles, 180 degrees, blah, 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 all these definitional characteristics of the thing, that is to misrecognize the triangle, to call it some atomic object that I can specify with a definition, but then at the same time not to recognize that triangles only have meaning with respect to perception, with respect to say geometry, with respect to empty space, right?
Hmm.
You can't have a line without the background that the
Hmm.
line is put into,
Hmm.
right? So even something as precise and seemingly timeless as a geometrical definition can always be described in relational terms. There's always
Hmm.
some other context that that concept is coherent in, right? And so to talk about emptiness is really to talk about the fact that nothing can ever be completely cordoned off from anything else, right?
Well, especially if everything is in a constant rate of process of
Correct.
change. If you're in this
Yes.
river of change, then again, it comes down to everything is relational to everything else and everything is empty. I think within that basic concept, even if it's
Yeah.
kind of vague.
Yeah. And so one thing that's important about pratitya samutpada and emptiness is another translation for pratitya samutpada beyond relational being is causality, which is sort
Hmm.
of interesting that the um, Nagarjuna claims that Atman isn't like some kind of essential thread that connects things. Everything is connected not in terms of essences, but through causality. But here they have a really different meaning of causality from how we understand it, say in Newtonian physics, right? This idea of a lineage, a
Okay.
line of cause and effect causing the next effect, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the chain of causality. Here, causality is understood as the complete network of all existence,
Ah,
right? Which is interesting also because in contrast to Newtonian physics, I suppose that means that if the complete network is constantly changing, is a process and not like a fixed network where you have all of the different true propositions or something, but rather that it's this network of constantly shifting um, relationships, that it would be hard to ever describe nature in terms of fixed laws of nature, right? That even the
yeah.
laws of nature are maybe very slowly changing, but they are also changing,
Mhm.
something like that. Um, because the true state of the world, the ultimate state of the world, I suppose, is this sense of interrelated change.
Flux, yeah.
Now, the thing about that, of course, is that even that assertion, ultimate reality is this network of constant change, isn't ultimately true. The reason it's not true is that in describing it, I have turned something that is not a noun into a noun. In other words, I've called it a continuously changing network of relationships. Network and relationships are nouns.
Mm.
And in order to actually get at it, I would have to somehow do something other than make a logical assertion about it, because those logical assertions turn everything into nouns,
Sounds.
right? And so that's where it comes down to this idea that perhaps you could express the doctrine of emptiness not in sentences about emptiness, but rather in activities. Um, but of course, that also has certain problems because you can never actually perform a negative action,
Mm.
right? You know that movie, there's a play too, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are Dead.
Hmm.
There's a scene where they're traveling to England where they, unbeknownst to themselves, are going to be executed. And one is saying to the other, "Do you think death could be like a boat?" And the other one says, "No, death isn't. It's the ultimate negative. You can't not be on a boat." And then the first one says, "I've frequently not been on boats." And then the other one says, "No, what you've been is not on boats." In other words, you can be on something other than a boat, but you can't not be on a boat. And it's the same with action. You can perform an action other than talking or other than this or that action, but you can't not perform an action.
Hmm.
You can't perform a negative action. And so the thing is that if it's true that language is inadequate to get at relational being, emptiness, etc., and then if we want to say, well, you do it through your practice, the way you act in the world, it seems like it's also a problem because you can't actually act negatively. You can't perform a negative action. What you can say is, I'm going to remain silent. But then the negation isn't in action. The negation is in a thought about the action you're not doing, right? Because remaining silent is actually still doing something, sitting there,
Yes.
Sure.
right?
I have to cut out here. It's been awesome. Just follow up with me an email when you guys want to meet again, uh, if that's all right. But my mom freaks out if I'm late.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
It's really
Yeah.
nervous. And thank you.
Sure.
I'll
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I'm recording this, so I can, the last 5, 10 minutes, I can send you the link and then you can
Okay.
watch what we talk about.
That's great. I appreciate it. Thanks so much.
All right. See ya.
Yeah.
Bye bye.
So then it would seem like emptiness is not something you can express even in action, let alone, So Nagarjuna says, I'm not making any claims. And like what you were saying with aphorisms, maybe the aphorism, that aphoristic style is a way of saying something without actually saying it.
Mhm.
The thing is that the negation there is always a second order description of what is actually there and what could otherwise have happened,
Yeah.
right? And so it's not really clear that you can ever get to negation except in thought, because
Yeah.
action is always positive.
Yep.
Um, so that maybe seems like a bit of a problem. I suppose that
Mm.
right down here I wrote a possible response to that. Well, I don't remember possible response. You want to respond to that at all?
No, it reminds me of the example that we spoke about. It's like there's no whale in my bathtub. Like, okay,
Right.
how do I show that there's no whale in my bathtub? Like, I can show an empty bathtub, but then that's an empty bathtub. Or I can put a
Right.
whale and then put like a convention or something. But these are all like conventions.
Yeah, that negation is always linguistic and
Yeah,
not actually, pragmatic or perceptual or whatever. Unless you
yeah,
do the thing where you say, well, our perception is conditioned by logical categories.
uh-huh,
And so when I see that there's a tree out there and I see it as a tree and not as a dog, I'm not sure that I really do see it that way. I think I just see the tree, but part of seeing a tree is seeing it as a non-dog or something
yeah,
like that. But I don't think that's really in the seeing of it. I think it's just in a second order description of the scene,
right.
And so I don't really see how you can get to negation without basically making assertions.
Yeah, yeah. Like if I took a tree, like an image of a tree, and I flipped it, I wouldn't say I'm looking at an upright version of an inverted tree,
But that's because you're
right?
comparing it to the normative concept of tree and the fact that it's wider on the top and narrower on the bottom,
Yeah,
usually, depending on the
right.
tree. But right, but then again, that's a second order operation in thought,
Yeah.
thinking about the perception and so on. I suppose that it's not really necessarily a problem for Nagarjuna because what he is doing is, again, not asserting even an action. Right?
Hmm.
It's not that he just doesn't assert that emptiness is true, but somehow he can express it in action. No, actually, even actions can only vaguely gesture at emptiness because actions are necessarily positive.
Right.
Can't not do something.
Yeah.
And so even that doesn't mean that emptiness is not ultimate. It's just that even in action, you can only vaguely gesture at it.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, I'm thinking how they figure like meditation and yoga and these practices that involve actions and how they attend closer to emptiness or nirvana because again these are positive affirming actions.
yeah, that's maybe right. That actually gets to the problem of whether there's a moral imperative
Yeah.
to either reach nirvana yourself or help others reach nirvana. I mean, it does seem like that is not affirming sort of that absolute conception of emptiness, but rather the more kind of easy to understand version of emptiness where you're just denying that anything has intrinsic being.
Right.
The reason I bring this up, of course, though, is that, Nagarjuna is kind of ambiguous with respect to what we can know about ultimate emptiness. He does claim that he's not making any assertions, but then he has two commentators that come later, um, Kandrakirti and Bhaviveka, or
Uh-huh.
Bhaviveka, however you say that. And Bhaviveka is the guy that wants to turn the emptiness doctrine into a form that can be put into rational debate with the Asteika schools.
Mm.
And Kandra Kirti is the one who says, no, emptiness is ultimately ineffable.
Mm.
And so, with Kandra Kirti, he's the one who's really committed to this idea that ultimate truth is empty in this completely ineffable sense that we can only vaguely gesture at.
Yeah.
Whereas Viveka presents the interpretation that emptiness is just a way of denying intrinsic being, that the doctrine of emptiness is just sort of like a critical tool to revise dogmatic beliefs.
Yeah.
It just so happens, though, that the more mystical tradition, Kanja Kirti, is the one that historically becomes more dominant.
Hmm. Hmm.
But then it's got these problems where it's like, you know, it's not even clear that you can, in Kanja Kirti's estimation, where it's this idea that emptiness is ultimately true, but you can't assert it, you can't even gesture towards it, that it's even really a coherent idea, right? It's like it's not really clear what you can do with that. You
Yeah.
know, it's because he wouldn't even be able to say that it's just a tool to diffuse dogma, right? He would, because then it's something positive that you can do. You can use emptiness
Yeah.
positively. But it
Right.
seems like there's something much more radical and maybe just mind-bending about the doctrine that emptiness really is ultimate, instead of the idea that emptiness is just a way of avoiding dogma.
Yeah.
The last thing that I want to say is it might be good to just talk a little bit about the tetralemma.
Mm.
We could do this in 5 minutes. We'll probably spend more time on this later because it is a little bit involved, but let me go up to where that was in the outline. Let's see if I can find it. There it is. Yeah. Okay. So Nagarjuna, Kandrakirti as well, have this method which is called prasanga,
Hmm.
which sometimes is
Hmm.
referred to as reductio ad absurdum. It's a little bit more involved than reductio, though. Essentially, what it is this kind of negative critical move where you don't assert anything positively yourself. You just say, oh, all these things that you believe, you know, Atman and all this kind of stuff, there are these inconsistencies, these contradictions, and so therefore those positions are false,
Ah,
right?
but they don't assert anything. They just
They don't assert, however, that anything is true.
right.
All they do is show that positions that they want to disagree with are self-contradictory. Now, one of the things that's tricky about that is that um, if it really comes down to you know how various times with paradoxes or even category mistakes, we've talked about the question about whether, say, P and not P, is that false or is it just nonsensical?
Mm.
Because if I say it's false that P and not P, if I want to say your position is false because it has this contradiction in it, then one thing it seems like I'm saying is it's true that contradictions are false,
Hmm.
right? Because
Yeah.
otherwise, um, I can't say that your position is false because it's contradictory unless contradictions are themselves false,
Yeah.
right? Um, and so then you have sort of a problem, which is that you are committed to an assertion about a truth, right? So then really the path that they take isn't reductio ad absurdum, where you say your position is false because it has this contradiction. They do something even more radical, which is to deny all possible configurations of truth and falsity. And that's
Mm.
what the tetralemma is. And we can look at this really quickly. If you go to page 9,
Yeah.
at the top of page 9, we've got this thing about prasanga.
Yeah.
One thing about, say, Western classical logic with reductio is if I say that P and not P, because it's a contradiction, it's false, one of the things that I can then do is
Hmm.
use that to argue for some other position. Let me put it this way. If I say that P and not P is true, if a contradiction could ever be true, then I can use that to support the negation of any other position I could possibly want. That's called the principle of explosion. You can
Mm.
look that up. I'm not going to spend too much time on that. But essentially, from a true contradiction, you can prove anything. So what they have to do is um, if they want to uh, really sort of gesture towards emptiness, they have to both affirm, or rather, they can't, here's how I'll say it, they can't say that contradictions can never be true. They also can't say that contradictions can never be false,
Mm.
because then that just means that the opposite of that position is true.
Mm.
What they have to do is say that it's all nonsensical. Every
Mm.
possible logical position you could take is nonsensical. And
That's
that's where the tetralemma comes in.
mm.
What the tetralemma is instead of just saying either P is true or P is false, you deny that P is true, you deny that P is false, you deny that P, I'm sorry, you deny that, let me start over. The tetralemma is as follows. You deny that P is true, you deny that not P is true,
Uh-huh.
you deny that P and not P is true, and you deny that P or not P is true.
Mm.
Essentially, what you've just done is uh, deny that any possible truth value obtains. Essentially, what
Yeah.
you've done is not say that any position is true or false, but rather that every position is essentially nonsensical.
Mm.
We can work through the various kinds of proofs here maybe next time, or
Yeah.
maybe in the chapter on epistemology, which I think is 2 chapters from now. But essentially, the way to look at these truth claims is very similar to the way that truth claims operate with infinite judgments.
Hmm.
So if I want to say, for instance, it's false that P and not P, which in classical logic doesn't make any sense because everything has to either be true or false.
Yeah.
But if I want to say that virtue is quadrilateral, no, I deny that virtue is quadrilateral. Okay, so then virtue is not quadrilateral. No, I deny that too. Or maybe I want to say either virtue is quadrilateral or it's not quadrilateral. No, I want to deny both of those. So then, you could go to the first two. Virtue is quadrilateral. No, that's not right. Virtue is not quadrilateral. No, that's not right. So if you treat any position as something like a category mistake, then you
Mm.
can show that any possible configuration of truth values doesn't work.
Yeah.
And that is, I think, what's going on in this radical move, this gesture towards emptiness. Not
Uh-huh.
that any position is true or false, but that every position is essentially just confused. It's just nonsense
Hmm.
because we're misrecognizing ultimate reality, perhaps, or something like that. But that
Yeah.
anytime you make an argument, you call X true, that's actually a category mistake. It's
Hmm.
it is somehow misapplying the predicate to the subject in some way or another.
Does this lead to a form of skepticism?
Oh, it's
Right?
entirely skeptical.
Yeah.
In fact, there's quite a lot of uh, literature on the relationships between Greek skepticism and Buddhism. So
Mm.
one of the things that's really interesting is that the Greek philosopher Pyrrho, who is the founder of Pyrrhonian skepticism, traveled with Alexander the Great during his conquest of India. And apparently there were a few Greek kingdoms, I think in northern India, that lasted until something like, I think, the first or second century AD. And there is some thought that Pyrrho was influenced by emerging Buddhism, but that Buddhists were also, to a certain extent, influenced by Pyrrho.
Mhm.
Uh, and so, yeah, there's definitely a lineage of skepticism throughout Buddhism. In fact, I think that in some ways, the best way to describe Buddhism is essentially as a skeptical movement. However, it's not skeptical in the Western sense for two reasons. One, it's not typically about knowledge claims, although sometimes it is. It's more typically about ontological claims about what really
Mhm.
exists.
Yeah.
The other thing about it is that it turns skepticism into a therapeutic way of life, which is true of certain Greek skeptical traditions, but quite often skepticism is kind of seen as, to the extent that it's seen as therapeutic, it's never really constructive. It's only getting rid of false dogma, but never can produce its own positive project.
Mhm.
And I think there's some question about um, the relationship between skepticism and Buddhism with respect to whether there's anything constructive in Buddhism. And it seems like, at least on the level of practice, meditation, and ritual, and all this kind of stuff, that there is more of a constructive aspect to Buddhism
Yep.
than in Western skepticism.
Mm.
Um, but with respect to argument, all of their moves are classic
Yeah.
skeptical moves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All
Good.
right.
Do we want to schedule another time?
Yeah, I think this time again 9:30 to
Yeah,
that
works fine.
works.
Fine for me. And, we'll
Yeah,
just read the next chapter,
5.
the one on ontology, and hopefully that will dig deeper and put things in a. I don't know that it's possible to put this stuff in a clear linear form, and that's kind of in a certain, to a certain extent, the lack of a clear linear exposition of ideas is adequate to at least Buddhism. I think to the Azteca schools too, to a certain extent. Although mostly with Buddhism, this idea of everything is being relational and so on. It's
Yeah.
actually the same kind of problem with Hegel. It's hard to talk about Hegel from the starting point, even though he does that in the Science of Logic. But you
Mm.
kind of feel like in order to really get a sense of what Hegel's on about, you kind of have to start in the middle with
Yeah.
everything already in operation, the
Right, right.
relationships already in effect, you know.
Yeah.
You can't build the relations up atomically.
Hmm.
You can have this kind of false analysis of the network of relations in terms of the nodes or the atoms or whatever. That's not adequate to the network itself, but you
Mm.
certainly can't build up the network from the atoms because relationship itself presupposes, or relationship is prior to atomic existence,
Right.
right? It's this kind of picture, right?
Very Bergson, like,
Yeah, I think that certainly from Hegel through Bergson, Deleuze. I mean, I was going back and looking at my notes on difference and repetition. And it's like, oh, this is where Deleuze gets this from. It's like it's all
yeah.
from Nāgārjuna, basically. It's like it makes a lot of sense when you bring these two together.
Yeah.
Actually, I think I was using Deleuze to understand Nāgārjuna better.
I
But
see.
but in any case, whatever direction you begin with, yeah, it's that different sort of approach where you just invert the logical priority between substance and process, right?
Yeah.
It's not that process is some emergent feature of different substances.
Right.
Rather, those substances are just sort of like snapshots of the process,
Right.
right? And so yes, it's essentially the same sort of thing. I suppose one other thing to keep in mind is that I think it's useful to think of process as, in some respects anyway, synonymous with relational network,
Hmm.
right? That relationship and process actually aren't different things,
Yeah.
right? To be a process means to be in this developing relationship,
Yeah.
right? So, but
I would like
that's
to
this
read
bigger picture. Yeah,
I'd like to read Difference in Repetition at some point with you.
yeah. Maybe we'll do that next.
Yeah.
It's pretty. It's not easy to read.
Yeah.
His use of language is not clear.
Yeah. Yeah.
And also you need to know. I think we've talked enough about Aristotle that most of that stuff probably wouldn't be too complicated. He talks a lot about Aristotle. He also talks a lot about Duns Scotus, the
Okay.
medieval philosopher. And there you need to develop a lot. He talks a lot about Hegel as
Mm.
well. But yeah, I think difference in repetition could be a fun thing to read.
Either that or Logic of Sense.
Yeah, I have never read Logic of Sense,
Okay.
or at least not closely. I've read summaries and stuff of it. So that might actually be good for me because then I get to
Yeah.
expand what I know.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, from what I understand, that one is even harder than difference in repetition.
Oh, really? Okay. I thought it was the opposite.
Yeah, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe difference in
Yeah.
repetition is harder. I'll take a look at that. Yeah, we could do some more Deleuze. We didn't really do much Deleuze last time. It was just like
Yeah.
one essay, but
Yeah.
I would want to like be kind of thorough with whatever book that we do, which means it would
Right.
probably be like a couple months or so on it.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, that could be fun, especially coming out of the Indian traditions. I think
Yeah.
there's a lot of similarity.
Right.
Yeah,
All right.
okay. Well, I will see
Good.
you next week, and
Yeah.
I'll send an email to Matt about that too. And
Okay.
and make sure you speak up whenever you want to,
Oh
because
yeah.
I
Yeah.
know
Yeah.
that Matt and I talk a lot.
Oh
So
no. 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 Yeah.
anyway, yeah, good. Okay, I'll see you
Okay.
next time.